Our next guest is Gregory Aliff, Vice Chairman and Senior Partner of Energy and Resources from Deloitte. For 10 years, Mr. Aliff served as the firm's U.S. Energy and Resources leader. He's a CPA and a member of the Board of Directors of the U.S. Energy Association and co-author of the annually updated industry reference book, Accounting for Public Utilities. Truly a master of this industry. During his 37-year career, he has appeared on industry programs sponsored by the American Gas Association, Edison Electric Institute, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, the United States Energy Association, and the NYSE corporate board member, a subsidiary of the New York Stock Exchange. A graduate of Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, he holds both a Bachelor of Science in Accounting and a Master's in Business Administration, and we're delighted to have with us today Greg Aliff.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm in this session with you today. My brief remarks are going to focus on what is the changing U.S. electric sector business model. This is something that I think we all see something, I guess, 2 or 3 things in the paper each day about the things that are going on that are challenging the business model of the electric sector. And my objective today, is not so much as to try to forecast, where this electric sector is going to go. If I knew what that was going to be, I wouldn't be here. But to discuss some of the economics in the marketplace that are going to influence the evolution, of the electric industry. Now, I'm going to talk in terms, in many respects, I'm going to talk in terms of what's going on across the U.S. And the question can be asked, well, why is that important to Texas? We have different facts and circumstances here, and I would agree. I hope that during the course of my remarks I can answer that question for you. I do want to point out that most of what I'm going to talk about today is based in large part on 2 papers that I've had the privilege to author over the last year. The first one's called The Math Does Not Lie, Factoring the Future of the U.S. Electric Power Industry, and the second one is Beyond the Math, Preparing for Disruption and Innovation in the U.S. electric power industry. And there are copies of these papers, if you're interested, all in the back. I'm in the process presently of writing the 3rd and final of what we're calling the Math series papers, which should be published hopefully sometime this spring. And many of my remarks today are going to reflect upon the things that are in the first 2 papers and some of the research that we're doing around the 3rd paper that I'm writing again as we speak. I'm going to touch briefly on 5 areas and just make a couple of observations in each of these areas. Fundamentals of the U.S. electric power sector business model. Very importantly, this is the foundation, on which that underpins the electric system today. And I think as we go forward, we have to acknowledge that and remember that this same foundation must be there regardless of where the electric sector goes in the future. I'm going to focus on what I believe and see as the major challenges facing the sector today, and my remarks in this regard will be significantly flavored by what I heard about 3 or 4 weeks ago at the Edison Electric Institute financial conference in Orlando, and what I heard the industry saying about the challenges that it faces also. The closest I'll come to making any sort of forecast of what the future looks like will be the 3rd bullet, which is The Math Does Not Lie, a look into the sector's future. And while it's not a forecast, I will suggest what I believe the operating environment is going to look like for the electric industry in the foreseeable future. The 4th item, disruption to today's electricity business model. I'll discuss what I think are the fundamental forces that are causing disruption in the electric sector that need to be watched and monitored as we go forward. And finally, the closest I'll come to maybe something that resembles a forecast will be some observations of what I see in the future for the industry and some concluding remarks. I should acknowledge up front that the comments that I make today are my own, based upon my observations and research, and are not necessarily the official word of Deloitte in that regard. Okay, this first slide seems very, very basic, and it is very basic. in many respects. But it is the fundamentals of the U.S. electric business model today. It is the fundamentals on which the electric sector as we know it has existed. The first is the regulatory compact that I think we have a tendency from time to time to just take for granted. And that is that the compact in the electric sector has forever been that you will deliver safe, reliable, affordable, some say reasonably priced electricity. And I would say that for the most part, the sector has had a phenomenal track record of successful in that over its history. I would also add that today there is a fourth element to this compact, and that is that electricity must be environmentally friendly or clean. I think this has clearly become a non-negotiable in the recent past. I don't personally think it takes carbon legislation to make this happen. I think the market forces are in place, the demands of the marketplace, et cetera, that will drive us in a fashion where electricity as we go forward will recognize the fact that it needs to be environmentally friendly. It's also easy to forget that in today's model, anything that gets built to bring electricity to businesses and consumers involves a substantial investment in a very, very long-lived asset. And this is an incredible long-term bet in some respects on what the future is going to hold. I think most of you know that whether you're building a transmission line or you're building a power plant today, you're still putting a 40-year life on these assets, suggesting that and betting that that infrastructure is going to be important, going to be utilized 40 years from now. And finally, the electric sector investment is based on long-term forecast of the levels of electricity load, usage, and prices. In the past, and this is very important, I think, in the past, if you were wrong on electricity load or electricity usage, you were usually wrong in terms of being of not guessing or not being able to project how much the increase was going to be. It was going to increase. You might get it wrong, but if you got it wrong, you were either a little bit too high or a little bit too low on the increase. And as we'll talk about a bit more in a moment, I think as we move forward today, we're moving into a period of time across much of this country, not necessarily here in Texas, but much of this country, where you're not only betting on if it's going to go up, or how much it's going to go up, you're also betting on if it's going to be flat or if it's going to be going down. Briefly, these are what I see as the largest challenges that the industry faces today. Put that first bullet on there largely for reference purposes. This is, across again, the whole U.S., this is the current sources of electric generation. What's interesting about this is that in a one-year period, there was a switch from coal being 42% to 37%, and natural gas went from 25 to 30 in a one-year period. So you can see how quickly natural gas has moved in favor in the country, probably not surprising. The second bullet is what I heard consistently across everything at the Edison Electric Institute meeting, and this is what I hear when I visit with my clients, is that right now today, the forecasted prices of natural gas in this country basically render any fossil fuel or nuclear to be uneconomical as a source of power generation going forward. And so if you see companies moving in the direction of building anything else, they are building it for either mandates for purposes of renewable portfolio standards, which is the next bullet there, or they're building it through justification of fuel diversification. But the economics alone, when I listen to the industry say nothing else today is economical but natural gas. And that last bullet, which I alluded to a few minutes ago, forecasts of future electricity demand are debatable, and in some cases are now being expected to decline. I'll talk a little bit more about that phenomenon here in just a few minutes. What does this mean? It means in many places across the country, and again, this is not necessarily the case here in Texas, but it means in many cases across the country, when you're seeing new capacity being built, it is not being built in a way that it's for the additional load that it's planning to serve. It's actually a balancing act of megawatts to continue to meet that safe, reliable, affordable, and environmentally friendly compact that I think the electric industry has, but not necessarily to be serving growth in demand and in usage. This is the fundamental premise of the first paper that we wrote, and that I have copies of here for you. And the purpose here was to take what is extraordinarily complex and to try to make it as simple as possible in order to provide a common platform for the industry for discussion and debate around what is actually going on in the electric industry in the U.S. today. And simply it is, if you have an equation and you can agree on the variables, then the answer is the answer. It's hard to debate the answer. Now, if you can't agree on the numbers necessarily of the variables, if you can agree on the variables, but you can't necessarily agree on the amount of the variables, I argue if you can agree on the direction of the variables, you might also get an answer you can't debate. And that's what we attempted to go through in this first paper. Basically, we said if the numerator is the cost to deliver kilowatt hour of electricity, and the denominator is the number of kilowatt hours of electricity delivered and sold, then the answer to that is how much it costs to deliver kilowatt hour of electricity. When you look at the numerator, and I won't go through all of these, when you look at the numerator, we feel we captured all of those elements of cost that are the ones that could substantially move the needle. And I will say that we've been fortunate, as we've written the paper, haven't had too many people come back and argue with what we captured here. The important thing is if you've got both capital costs and you've got operating costs, obviously. And the two that I point out here in the capital costs are the ones that really, I think, are the kind of the new guys on the block, so to speak, that have changed the paradigm so rapidly, are the environmental regulation compliance and the nuclear safety regulations, in large part post-Fukushima for the nuclear regulations. But those two items, I think, are relatively new in terms of the amount of impact that they're having on the cost side of the equation. If you look at the denominator, the number of kilowatt hours of electricity delivered and sold, the first couple items there, weather, economy, obviously vary over time. But over time, we've traditionally thought that that little bit of a roller coaster evens out over time. New sources of electricity that we've all witnessed for the past number of years, largely electronics in the home, economic development, et cetera, all obviously increase the denominator. And the last two items are the ones that I think, once again, are truly the new kids on the block, so to speak. And that is the technological advances that we're seeing in energy efficiency. It's not that we haven't seen them for a long time, it's the pace at which we're seeing technological advances take place. And finally, customer attitudes and behaviors. And I think that's a very important one that, quite frankly, no one really predicted, and I think also got masked by the recession, and as a result has caught a lot of people a bit off guard, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. I won't go through all this for the sake of time. I want to make sure we stay on time here. The important point here is we did a study in 2011 and 2012, and this is kind of synopsis of what consumers across the entire United States told us about their views toward electricity consumption. The interesting thing was in 2011, most everyone thought we were still in a recession. And at that point in time, 68% said they were doing extra things to reduce their electricity consumption. And the things they were doing are listed below, largely behavioral in nature, things you would expect people to do. However, you move to 2012, most American consumers were feeling better about their personal economic situation, and yet the numbers went from 68% to 83% that were doing something. We labeled the consumer the resourceful consumer, and I think this is very important. The reason we labeled them the resourceful consumer was it was clear that it was not about sacrifice. It was about just doing it because it was the smart thing to do. It was just smart to turn the thermostat a little bit more than you normally would, turn the lights off, and not that it was a sacrifice on the part of consumer. For that reason, we started to feel that some of these behaviors are obviously entrenched. Now, when it comes to technologies, things like controllable thermostats and apps on your phone and all those types of things. Obviously, though, at this point, the level of usage was relatively low, but it was largely among younger adults. Interestingly, we repeated the study in 2013, and this is one of the biggest changes in 2013, was the amount of interest that was growing among the baby boomers in using applications, et cetera, technology to control their energy usage. If you move to businesses, what's most important in here is the fact that across the U.S., the vast number of businesses believe that energy savings is important. It's important to stay competitive. 90% of American businesses, about 250 more employees, told us they had some plan to reduce their electricity consumption, and as you can see, also to reduce their consumption of natural gas, their carbon footprint, and their transport fleet, which again is not surprising. The point here is the level of target. On average, businesses were targeting 23% reduction in electricity usage, not price, usage was the measure, over approximately a 3.5-year period. And we said to ourselves at that point, wow, if they achieve half of that, that is a very, very substantial number. And this is the slide we call the math in action. And that's simply taking what we found when we went out and looked at reports and data in the marketplace, what we found based upon our studies, and the snapshot of it shows it pretty clearly that there's very little impacting the numerator other than new technologies that suggest costs are going down. And on the flip side, when you look at the denominator, there are very few bright sizes to suggest that electricity usage is going to go up, which spells the dilemma. If you got increased cost and declining usage, and this would quite frankly be declining usage over an extended period of time for the first time in the history of this country, then you're going to have a higher cost per kilowatt hour. And that in and of itself maybe is not so important, but it's what it leads to. And we go back to the studies that we did. Businesses and consumers both said what would motivate them to do more would be if the return on investment on what they did was faster, if it was more economical to do it. So as costs go up, consumers and businesses are motivated to do more, to do less, and as they do less, costs don't go down, but the amount of usage goes down, and guess what? The cost goes up again. I like to refer to this as the potential for a vicious cycle. There are others out there that call this the death spiral. I don't go that far, but I do think there's the potential for a vicious cycle here if businesses and consumers mean what they say. And very importantly, and this is what I've kind of moved to here in the last few minutes, is that we acknowledge that every company has to do its own math. Every company is in a different circumstances, and they need to see how this would impact them. But if you take this as a whole across the country, I would argue that we see substantial forces coming that can disrupt the industry model, as we know it today. This first one is federal and state regulatory compliance. And in large part, what we're really talking about is the cost of environmental compliance. And what hasn't been lost on me when I've gone around and talked to a lot of people is that, again, I think Texas is one of the exceptions here, one of the few exceptions. Most of what is getting invested in American electric infrastructure today does not create any efficiency or productivity. It is solely creating a level of compliance and a level of reliability that is necessary, but it's not increasing reliability beyond what standards would demand. It's not increasing productivity, quite frankly, hardly in any shape or form. The declining demand for electricity that I just mentioned, which could create this vicious cycle. And obviously, much of what you all here talk about at this conference, the advances that are being made today in renewables and in storage and in energy efficiency, and the impact that they will ultimately obviously have on alternative availability of electricity to consumers and businesses beyond what they've traditionally had. This next bullet is ask the question, and it kind of comes back to what I said earlier. Why is it important, if you're sitting here in Texas, to know what's going on around the rest of the country? Yeah. I don't think disruption is going to come in anything that will resemble being even across the country. It's going to be very lumpy. It's going to depend in large part on what's going on in a particular state or in a particular region that will drive that state or region to do something different. And based upon the research that we've been doing, I would argue that, and I think most of you would probably agree, that disruption is probably already occurring, for good or bad, in California, with the types of things that they're experimenting with and doing in California. I also believe that the next wave of real disruption to the models we know today will take place in New England. Why New England? High prices and projected soaring prices in the future in New England. Low economic growth projected in the coming years. Lots of standards out there supporting renewables, and also a very unique situation where natural gas does not today suggest the same level of solution that it suggests in other areas of the country, just due to capacity constraints of getting natural gas into the Northeast. You know, why is this all important? I think this is important because while electric businesses today generally, to some degree, operate within what I'll call a franchise territory, technology and I would argue policy have no bounds. And what I mean by that is if a technological solution works and gets adopted in one part of the country to solve a problem, it can go anywhere. And I would also argue that policy has no bounds. If something doesn't work somewhere else, I doubt others are going to try it. If something does work somewhere else, they may well try it as a way to solve their own problems and their own concerns as their electric sector evolves in their particular region or their particular state. I would also say that, again, working with the electric sector, I don't think these folks have their heads buried in the sand. If you'd asked me this 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said yes. I don't think they do today. I think they know they've got these problems and concerns. I think they're trying to solve them. I think they're at the very beginning trying to figure these things out, but they don't have their heads buried in the sand. Let me just real quickly wrap up by saying that my observations for the future. I think, again, as I said earlier, I think this is important. Most of the baseload generation that we're going to see in this country moving forward is going to be to replace existing capacity and not to add new. I know Texas is an exception in this regard, but across the country, this is going to be a phenomenon. For the foreseeable future, natural gas is going to be the answer that we're going to see. Natural gas, in many respects, is probably not only, as I say below, going to be the fuel of choice, but it's also going to be the fuel that provides that bridge or that long-term transition to a world where we see more large-scale renewables, where we see distributed generation, and where we see the microgrids. And I guess I would just close with a comment at the bottom of that page, which is one of the concerns I have personally, and that is as we move into this future and we see natural gas as kind of the solution, are we indeed putting all of our eggs in one basket? We've been there, done that in the past, and are we missing something this time around also? So with that, I'll I appreciate your time, and we'll move on. Okay.